Hines is proud to partner The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. Hines is a leading global real estate investment manager. Hines owns and operates $93 billion of assets across property types and on behalf of a diverse group of institutional and private wealth clients. Hines' ambition? Well, in the words of its chairman and CEO, Jeffrey Hines, to be the best real estate investor, manager and partner in the world. Find out how Hines is making that dream a reality. Head to hines.com now. Hines, a leader in real estate investing and management since 1957. Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. On January the 7th, 2025, the city of Los Angeles declared a state of emergency in anticipation of severe winds and the increased fire risk that they could pose. That same day, the first of a terrifying series of wildfires ignited that would hit the Southern Californian area, causing urban destruction on an unprecedented scale. The Palisades and Eaton fires have been the most devastating, with thousands of acres affected and thousands of structures damaged or destroyed. As we go to air, these two fires are still not completely extinguished. So how did the city respond before, during and after these events? And how do we make our cities more resilient to such disasters in the future? And finally, what will be the lasting lessons for Angelenos as well as the rest of the world? That's ahead in the next 30 minutes here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. First today, we want to understand how climate change and urban planning decisions influenced by the climate have caused or exacerbated these wildfires. Andrea Thompson is the Environment, Energy and Earth Sciences editor at Scientific American, and she joins me down the line to explore this. Andrea, thank you so much for coming on. Now, we know the topic of climate change and the impact that humans have on the climate can be political and is disputed by some. But what's your take on the role that these contributing weather effects like wind, rain and heat did have on causing these recent fires?
I'll be clear that this isn't just my take, but is what scientists who study this for a living have shown very clearly in numerous studies. So basically, for any fire, you kind of have several ingredients. The initial spark that causes it, that's something that's still under investigation. We don't know, and that's going to take several weeks or months to figure out. But then you have the conditions that that spark happens in. And in this case, there were some unusually strong Santa Ana winds. These are a natural phenomenon that happens in Southern California as a result of pressure differences between a high pressure system over sort of the interior west and low pressure system off California. And that difference creates wind going very rapidly from the high to the low pressure. It goes through these canyons that are really prevalent in the mountains there, which speed up the winds. And then as it goes down slope, those winds also get hotter and drier. So they're sort of prime conditions to spread any fire that does start. And then all of that also happened on sort of a larger background of the climate where you have what is increasingly becoming a cycle in Southern California. Well, you'll have one or two really wet winters, which mean all the brush and grass that is prevalent in this region grows leaps and bounds in the spring because it has tons of water. And then summer hits, the dry season, and it is much hotter and drier than in the past. And so all of that grass and brush dries out and is just ready to go if there's any spark. So we're increasingly seeing that sort of wet winter, then very dry season happen. And also we are seeing the dry season push longer in the fall. So the traditional dry season was summer, early fall. That is pushing later and later into the fall, which means it is overlapping more with this traditional Santa Ana wind season, which happens from like October to January. And this was the driest start to what should be the wet season there on record. And it's been incredibly warm too. And there have been a few studies that actually have shown, quantified how much more likely this is, how much drier it was because of the warming we've seen from climate change.
Now tell me, you outline a situation there which I've heard in other fires where people have said, in the past they cleared the brush, or in the past there was controlled fire management that ensured that there wasn't this build-up of dry material when flames could come and destroy houses. Is there a debate here about that this is a situation, while not possible to manage away completely, could have been managed better or should be going forward managed more?
It can be a little difficult to say for any particular fire. And some of the past fires that have happened in recent years in California have been forest fires. Those are a little bit different than these, which are brush and grass fires. So forest fires happen because of the buildup of fuel, of all the leaves and sticks and other things that sort of grow or accumulate in the forest. Whereas brush and grass is much more dependent on how much the grass and brush have grown in the previous spring. Whereas in forest fires, it's kind of built up over many years. Now, there is still, something with brush and grass fires. You can have this build up over several years, but they're slightly different types of fires. Prescribed burns can be used in both situations. I haven't heard as much about prescribed burns with this sort of terrain as I have with forest fires. But the way fire management has been done over the past 50, 100 years has been to put out any fires. And that does mean that you do get, a bigger buildup of all this vegetation than you would if fire sort of naturally spread as it did before people or when Native Americans kind of managed it. Prescribed burns are always a tricky thing too, because you can't do a prescribed burn in somewhere like the Pacific Palisades where it's a suburb, there are houses. You can do it in parts of a forest where no one's living. So there are a lot of tricky questions that come into play around what kind of management you can do like that and where.
One of the things I think that shocked and horrified onlookers around the world was to see the speed at which the fires moved through these neighbourhoods and the scale of total destruction. I know that there's a tradition of building with timber, and many of these buildings seem to catch alight within seconds. But they're often paced out. They're not too crammed, but the fire leapt in extraordinary ways. I know there's a debate about could you build in a different way or could you build better? Is there a way of putting in more fire breaks? But when you look at the built environment and how it intersects with this brush and with the landscape, do you think there is a debate about how you build back in a better way, or is this just a dangerous territory to be building in?
Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both. So in this particular situation, once that fire got started, the ferocity of the winds, this was a pretty rare Santa Ana wind event in terms of the speeds that the winds were reaching. There's really nothing you can do to fight that fire. The flames are moving so fast, the wind is pushing embers out so far ahead that you can attempt to save individual structures, but it's mainly an evacuation and a rescue situation. But looking at the larger picture, there are definitely ways you can build homes to make it harder for them to catch. There are screenings you can put on any intake that's going to go into the house, and you can make sure that windows are very tight so that embers don't get inside the house. The materials that you build the house itself or the roof or things with can matter. There are codes in California to keep vegetation, a certain distance away from the house to help prevent those catching and then catching the house on fire. So there are some things like that, but there is a risk, even with those measures, some places are at higher risk of wildfire than. So there are questions of where should we be building, where should we not? And then if we are building in a place, what do we do? What do we require that's going to minimize the risk as much as possible?
Well, it's certainly a terrifying situation that's being described in Los Angeles right now. And interesting to hear that there are plenty of decisions to be made before we think about what happens next. Andrea, thank you so much for speaking to us.
The Andrew McNally House was built in 1887 at 654 East Mariposa Street, Altadena, California. It was the home of Andrew McNally and remained a private house throughout its lifetime. McNally's story was like many others who found themselves in this part of Los Angeles. He was an immigrant, in his case arriving from Ireland to seek success. And he found it in the printing industry, joining forces with William Rand to make Rand McNally, one of the most recognizable names in the publishing industry. Like many other notable pieces of residential architecture in Los Angeles, including the Zane Grey Estate or Will Rogers Ranch House, this Queen Anne-style house was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The house on East Mariposa Street was designed by architect Frederick Roehrig and offered soaring vistas of the Los Angeles area. The grounds were also noteworthy, with an aviary along Mariposa Street and a collection of cedars, which would later come to be known as Christmas Tree Lane, also listed in the National Register. The Andrew McNally House, the Zane Grey Estate, and Will Rogers Ranch House were all lost to the 2025 Eaton and Palisades fires.
We look next at how leaders have performed in Los Angeles over the course of these wildly destructive fires. So I'm joined now by Mark Edelman, a long-standing campaign and communications consultant and a Los Angeles resident. Mark, let's start in your wheelhouse, communications. How well have important figures in Los Angeles managed to communicate vital information during this emergency?
I think that when you look at a lot of disasters, sort of writ large, there's obviously the disaster and what it does to everybody that is touched by it. But the issue of communications becomes paramount to making people feel that they are in good hands and hopefully feel supported by the powers that be. And I think that there have been some examples of great communications that have gone on over the last few weeks. And there have been examples where it hasn't gone so well and has led to a great amount of confusion and disconsternation about what people should do, what they should have been doing during the fire, and certainly now in the aftermath.
As outsiders, even here in Europe, we've seen the collision between the national government, especially now. We've seen the issues of both state and city and neighbourhood voices putting out messages. Is that part of the issue here, that there are so many invested people with a message to get out there?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, there's a few examples I can kind of point to you. Certainly during the fires, there was a lot of confusion about who should evacuate, who should not evacuate. You saw this play out in real time in the Altadena fire, the Eaton Canyon fire as it's known, but Altadena was the town that, got eradicated basically by it, where one part of the city got a phone warning to evacuate, and the other side of the city didn't get one for hours until after that. And that's a no-brainer right there, where half the community knows what's going on and the other half doesn't. There will be a lot of attention paid to that going forward about what happened. A lot of us now, as we all live on our smartphones, get alerts. There were alerts that were sent in the middle of the night that everybody got to say that they should evacuate. That was a mistake. And in a heightened environment where people don't know what's going on, led to a lot of stress. You've got this area that is the second biggest city in the country. You've got Los Angeles County, which is population-wise as big as 38, 39, 40 different states. And then you've got the state of California. And then you've got, of course, the federal government. And you've got a lot of hands in the pot. So it creates its own recipe for, well, who should I be listening to? Am I listening to the county? Am I listening to the city? You saw, of course, President Trump came here last Friday and did not include the governor in the roundtable that he had, where he had gathered many city officials and county officials and members of Congress. So when you've got a lot of stakeholders, it, I think, can create a lot of confusion. And I'm not sure that government officials always put their best foot forward. So when you have these press conferences, especially during the moment by moment of the fires when it started, and we were really in it, and you've got 35 people on a dais waiting to speak, and you've got the fire chief of the county and then of the city and then the LA sheriff and then the chief of the LAPD and the mayor and the county supervisor. And I know why they do that. It's to show, unity, and we're doing this together. But, if you're in danger and you're looking for information and you want to know, can I drink the water or whether I should stay in my house, seeing a bunch of people on a stage doesn't necessarily give you the information you need in the way you want to receive it. And what's also, I think, been very interesting about this is that certainly in the United States, we've seen a real disappearance of local media and news. A lot of newspapers have closed around the country. A lot of news affiliates that are on television that used to exist don't necessarily exist everywhere. The local news was really the heartbeat for a lot of people to tune into and really kind of get information that they weren't feeling like they were getting from the government at all times. And, in a world where we all sort of turn to social media to kind of find out what's going on with the disinformation that I think, is pervasive, it reminds, I think, and should punctuate why local news reporting is very important. People who understand the community, people who understand the cartography of the area and where these things are happening, and being able to sort of dial into useful information that people need in real time when it really does come to life or death, and being able to see if your home is going to still be there later that day.
Obviously, for the people who've been impacted by the fire, whose homes have been damaged by the fire, you understand how they must feel. But I wonder what the general mood was of the city. I've been in other cities when there have been terrorist attacks or there have been these large-scale events where the mood for everybody changes. What happened to the people whose homes didn't get burnt down? What's the feeling, do you think, in the city?
It's interesting. I'm a native Los Angelino. I grew up here. I did live in Washington, D.C. during 9/11. Los Angeles very much took on that tenor of, I think, a few things. Number one, like, this is an attack. In this case, it was from nature. This was something that even if you weren't in the exact areas that were on fire, the smoke, you could smell it, you could see it. When you walked outside your house, there was ash everywhere. It brought out this sort of, and you've seen this after other communities have gone through terrible things. Like I remember the Boston Marathon and the hashtag Boston Strong. This very much felt like that with Los Angeles. Everybody knew somebody that was affected by these fires, and there were a lot of people looking inwards to see how they could help and what that would look like, whether it was trying to take friends or neighbors in, or all these people and all the materials that people have that make up their lives, from medicines to diapers to just a jacket to keep warm. How do we get people that kind of help, which is very much of the moment and doesn't even address the bigger situation? But it really did feel like, these events bring out sometimes the worst in people. And you saw that with some looting and people trying to take advantage of a horrible situation. But by leaps and bounds, so many people came out and are still coming out trying to figure out how to support all these victims and make their lives a little bit better going forward. And it's not great that these are the things you need to have happen to see that in your neighbors and your community. But thank God we do, because Los Angeles is a very fragmented city. It's made up of many different neighborhoods and municipalities, and a lot of people don't go to a lot of different parts of LA other than where they live or work. And all of a sudden, you really did feel like this is, really one city that, again, is under attack, in every way by Mother Nature.
And again, tell me other instances we've covered here. On the Urbanist, for example, in Beirut after the blast in the port, many people you spoke to, Lebanese people after that, they were like, stop telling us we need to have resolve, we'll endure and it's going to be okay, you'll rise again. Some people in these moments think, okay, that's enough for me. I can't rebuild. I don't want to do that. Other people, they are kind of more resolute that they will go back to where the land, where their home was and start over. What's your feeling when you've spoken to friends and you hear those conversations? Do you think people are being defeated by this, or that they think this is a moment of change, how we build and how we construct, but I'm not being shifted from this city?
I think it's all those things. Look, there are a lot of people, certainly in the two main fires of Eaton and then the Palisades, that this is all they had in many ways, their homes and their life savings and their equity and everything that they have had are wrapped up in these places that no longer exist. There's a lot of question going forward about what a rebuilding process would look like. Do people want to go back to those places? I think a lot of them do. I think the majority of them want to do that. But the reality of trying to get that done in a way that is sustainable for them personally and in some sort of timeline that actually answers the questions of where do I live now and where will I live in the next couple of years. This city, it is a resilient city. It's a city like many that live off the razor's edge of disasters that can happen. Fires are not new to Southern California, although I would point out as the climate has changed, there are more of them. They are hotter. They come later in the year or earlier in the year in this case. We also live in earthquake country that at any time something can be disrupted very quick. For the paradise that people make of Southern California, there are a lot of cons to living here. And we're coming off, like the rest of the world, the pandemic, which is 5 years now, but really hit this community hard like it did many others. And then for a community too that is so connected to show business, a strike that put people out of work for months and months and months. And I do think there are questions that, some people do have about, is this where I want to continue to make my life? For all the beauty and the serenity that people get by living in a climate where you have 300 plus days of sunshine and you have the ocean and the beautiful mountains and the desert community very close. It's an expensive place to live. And if you feel like you're living on some sort of quicksand kind of environment where if you have the choice and the ability to go somewhere else, I do think some people are having those conversations. There's also this long-term questions about the toxic chemicals that came out of all the materials that are built and are part of what make up people's homes. What does the air quality look like going forward in these communities? What does the water quality look like going forward in these communities? I think it is giving people at least some pause to think about, is this where I still want to make my home? But I do think there are a lot of people that are very resilient and this is their home. Whether it's politics or Mother Nature, they're not going to be told different that they can't live there.
Mark, thank you very much for joining us today on The Urbanist.
The Bunny Museum was first opened to the public in 1998 and moved to its premises at 2605 Lake Avenue, Altadena, California in 2017. The museum was dedicated to rabbits, and at its peak, it housed over 35,000 rabbit-related items in its 7,000-square-foot space. Co-founded in the home of Candace Frazee and Steve Lubansky, the couple's collection began with a personal exchange of rabbit-related gifts and grew into the world's largest collection of bunny memorabilia. Much like Altadena's Theosophical Society or Theater Palisades, this site was an example of Angelino's long-standing ability to attract the weird and wonderful and find like-minded people no matter what your cultural pursuit or special interest. The Bunny Museum and its collection, excluding its live animals, Altadena's Theosophical Society headquarters, and Theatre Palisades were all lost to the 2025 Eaton and Palisades fires.
Finally today, we look to transport, an ongoing thorn in the side of Angelenos, whose public transit and traffic management have in the past been the envy, well, of very few. I'm joined now by John Rasson, the founder and CEO of Commotion, whose annual event in Los Angeles explores mobility innovations and advancements in the city and beyond. John, thank you for coming onto the programme. Now, you put out a statement as the fires took hold, stressing your support for the city. But how big a challenge does this present when it comes to the question of mobility?
It's a monumental challenge, but I think it's important to realize that LA has already taken great steps to improve its mobility landscape, starting in 2017, which was the year that we launched Commotion in Los Angeles as a conference on future urban mobility. This was the year also that voters approved Measure N, which freed up billions and billions, over $100 billion for public transit in LA. I mean, LA is the largest car city in the world, but made a very big decision to embrace public transportation. And so it's being rolled out across the vast city. And that's not going to stop because of the fires. And I think if you look at the history of just cities that have been devastated by fires or destruction, whether it's the city of London in 1666 or Chicago in 1871 or San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century, history shows us that these cities rebuild much stronger and come out of it in a much, much better shape. I mean, London, because of the fire of London in 1666, London became a world city. It embraced brick and stone, and streets were widened. It became easier to move from point A to point B instead of on these little narrow medieval thoroughfares, etc.
So are you hoping that when it comes to the rebuild, that these questions about limiting fire risk where you can, about allowing services, easy access to neighbourhoods, that these questions at that level of mobility will be discussed as well?
Oh, well, I mean, there's no question. But, you also have to look at what's coming down the pike. So not only will we have massive rebuilding, and I think President Trump made it clear that the federal aid will be massive. So there could be extraordinary resources deployed in Los Angeles. And remember that next year, in the summer of 2026, the FIFA World Cup is coming to Los Angeles. The year after, we have the Super Bowl. And then the year after, of course, we have the Olympics in Los Angeles. And all of these mean that a focus will have to be made on how to improve transit, how to improve mobility in the cities. And this is already happening already. So I think rebuilding plus the mega events, we'll see a new Los Angeles come out of this. I have no doubt about that. I mean, it looks very bleak now, and it's horrific for those who've lost their homes, but it will be rebuilt. The city will be rebuilt, and I think it will be rebuilt better.
Do you think the fire will have any impact on the way that people perceive public transport? As you said, with the Olympics coming, the Olympics have made a big promise about using public transit to get people around the games and the venues. And I see that obviously after the fires, it was the Metro that came forward and said, look, we'll be able to have a scheme here to offer people free travel on the system while we cope with some of the fallout from this fire. Do you think this could be a moment where people actually begin to embrace more the need for more public transport, and also for people who didn't have access to multiple cars, evacuating from neighbourhoods even was aided if you had access to public transport?
Yes, I think that will be the case. And I think if you look back to the last time that LA hosted the Olympics back in the 80s, Angelenos behaved very well. I mean, they didn't use their cars during the Olympic Games. I mean, the freeways were traffic free for the days of the Olympics. So I think they'll behave again very, very well this time around, with an added incentive that there's more transit that's been built out. The Olympics will mean a lot of bus rapid transit, which is good. And I think, dedicated lanes for buses and things like that. The problem, I don't want to gild the lily too much, because I think the real problem in LA is a governance problem. And I don't mean in any way to diminish what Mayor Karen Bass and her team has been doing. It's a really tough job right now. But LA, the system of governments is just bad. The city of LA is one of 88 independent cities in the county of LA. And, we think of LA as the second largest American city. Well, in fact, the county of LA is the second largest, of which there are 88 cities, is the second largest American city. But the city of LA itself is, not quite 4 million people out of a county population of 10 million people. The city has a pretty small budget, 10 billion plus budget, which is nothing if you consider that the city of New York has a budget of over $100 billion. So we have traditionally very weak governance in Los Angeles. There are multiple jurisdictions that compete. And I think my hope is that somehow we can improve this governance system coming out of this tragedy. That's a long shot. But, if there's any way we could strengthen the role of the mayor of LA, for example, I think that would be a very good thing.
Perhaps just on that point, is another challenge there. Obviously, these are, in many countries, not just in the United States, but these are times of very polarized debate. And certainly around the fires, there was lots of finger pointing and some ideas that bordered on conspiracy theory, with the idea that the smart city was somehow to blame for part of what had happened. Do you think when we are seeing a division in how people view California, view Los Angeles, view city governance, that there is a potential still for a coming together of ideas and ambition here?
Yeah, Andrew, I think that's a good question. I hope so. I think when push comes to shove, I think Californians and Americans indeed sort of unite and come together. I think this is one of those moments. And I think, for example, a lot of pundits predicted that President Trump's trip would be a disaster, that he'd exacerbate some of the political tensions that are brewing in the state. And, he actually was very generous. And he said, we'll give you everything that you need. And I think that's going to happen. I think that people will come together. This moment calls for it. I hope that means also intelligently finding ways to build better, to build faster. That has been the case. In so many ways, LA and California, is, again, terrible governance. It takes years to get permitting done for new construction. It's very opaque system. It's, in some cases, extremely corrupt. So I think this is a moment to try and really clean that up. And I think there will be vast public support for it as well.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's always great to get your opinion on these sorts of things.
Lucy Sheriff is a climate reporter who lived in Pacific Palisades, California. Reporting for the BBC in January, Sheriff recalled a terrifying ordeal, watching flames creep nearer to her home and with the sky glowing orange and ash raining down like snow. Sheriff managed to evacuate safely, but by the time she was able to return, her house was gone. There are countless numbers of homes, businesses, and important institutions left leveled. Now, many of the victims face further challenges, with insurers refusing to pay out, rent prices skyrocketing, and family livelihoods unable to return to normal. At least 29 people's lives and more than 16,000 structures were lost to the 2025 Eaton and Palisades fires.
And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. We hope that all of our listeners in Southern California are safe. And our thoughts with those who have been affected and continue to be affected by the greater Los Angeles wildfires. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by Carlotta Ribello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.